I don't know why the other stream wasn't working, but here we are. So welcome to the live stream for Fluxcore. And the original stream was supposed to have carried everything, but this is only the first one I've done like this. So I got to mute myself here. All right, sorry about that. So I'm trying to set it up so that I can actually read the chat. So is the chat going at the same time? And if you have any questions, dump it in chat. I'll leave a link for a Discord room after this. And everything we talk about will pretty much be in the descriptions. Anything I show, it'll all be in there as well. So I recently came down with the cold, so sorry if there was a little nasally, if you will. So just give everybody a second here. There's going to be some movement of the camera here and there because I've got some things I want to show you. This isn't a high-end studio where I get to go to camera 2, camera 3, camera 4, right? So we got one camera that we will end up moving around. And the goal is to kind of give you some basics on Fluxcore welding. We're not teaching how to be a structural welder, how to be a code welder. It's you went out and you bought yourself your first Fluxcore welder, whether it be a Harbor Freight or Lowe's or any of the other, pick a dozen places. You want to get started, you've got some projects that you want to weld together. That's primarily what this is for. And if you've been welding for 20 or 30 years, well, there's probably going to be things you're going to pick apart on this, but I also kind of doubt you're going to be watching this one as well. But I'm always open for some insight. If you've got some insight that we didn't cover, or there's things you'd like to cover, make sure you bring it up in the chat, and we'll try to cover it there as well. So let's see, we got a couple people. I appreciate it. And let's see here. Got a couple comments. So as you get older, the distance is an issue when you read. So I appreciate anybody who's dumping things in the chat. John Lee and DCM 060. So I very much appreciate you guys joining in. All right, so let's jump in. So what is Fluxcore? Right, so there's two types of welding wire out there. There's called hard wire, and that's primarily just a hard wire with nothing in the cords. You pick your brand, it's up to you, but it uses a gas shield, and there's several different types of gas out there that you can use with the hard wire. We use a C25, and that's not what we're going to be covering today. What we're going to cover today is a Fluxcore wire. And once again, there's several different brands. Now, I have put a link in the descriptions to some Lincoln wire, which is typically what you'll buy at like a Lowe's or something like that. That'll have some information. So after this, if you want to go back and look, because it talks about out of position welding. And what that means is you're not welding horizontally or flat. Whether you're welding vertical up or overhead, things like that. It talks a little bit more about your settings. And what that is there's a steel or a filler. Usually it's like you get on camera, you kind of get a little tongue-tied a little bit. There's a steel outer shield to a flux core. And I'm going to say it's kind of like your soldering wire, where there's a flux on the inside. There's a flux inside of this too. So as you heat this up, as you're welding, that inner gas gives you your shield and allows you to shield it from outside contaminations. And still, I'm hoping that there's not anybody on the other stream. Waiting for it to start. A couldn't figure out how to get that started. So once again, apologize for that. All right, so Fluxcore. So there's a couple things that I'll throw in there that I think everybody should have as we dig into this, that I think it's overlooked a little bit. A couple obvious things you're going to need is a welding helmet. Now with Fluxcore, you get a lot of fumes. Obviously, I can't wear one today, but especially Fluxcore, I always wear a respirator because this stuff puts off a lot of fumes, a lot of contaminations. And it doesn't take long before your shielding lens is covered in, goo, right? So that's 15, 20 minutes worth of welding with Fluxcore. So cover shields are going to be your friend. If you're welding a lot in the garage, excuse me, the respirator is going to be your big friend. And for myself, I have to wear reading glasses when I weld, because if you can't see the puddle, how can you possibly weld with it, right? So those are some big things. A lot of people want to deny that, but get you a good set of reading glasses, even if you don't think you need them, and get the blue blockers. It really does help when you're welding. All right, so we're going to cover this as a short circuit is the style of MIG welding we're going to be covering. We're not going to be covering spray transfer or globular. Strictly short circuit, which is typically what you would use in your house. And if you guys have any questions, don't be afraid to pop them up in chat, and this will all be posted afterwards as well. So on your wire for flux versus hard wire, some machines are different than others. This is where I'm going to have to move the camera. So your polarities are different for reverse. I'm sorry. So on Fluxcore, your DCEN, your electrode negative, right? So that's why your gun is here. Your gun is going up to your negative line, and your ground is positive. So DCEN, the DC electrode negative, is what you run in Fluxcore, right? And DCEP, or positive, is what you use when you're welding gas, right? So how do you know what your settings should be? Well, one of your biggest things on most of your welders, you'll get this chart. And the chart is a really good setting for what you need to, a good place to get started. So, can't wait to be able to use multiple cameras. So just to recap, and I know I said it wrong the first time. So DCEN is what you run your Fluxcore on. DCEP is what you run your hard wire with gas on. And then go toward, if you, on your machine, you'll be able to see that chart, and it'll tell you what should be running. You'll typically run less wire speed on Fluxcore because it takes a little longer for it to melt. So, all right. So you'll either have two types of guns. You either have a gun that looks something similar to this, where it'll just have a cover shield over it. And this is kind of atypical. It might not have the shield on it, right? You might have just this. And the shield there is just there to protect the gun itself. So all the contaminations. Now you can run it on the standard MIG, and I don't have the cover shield. I just use the standard shield on the normal MIG. All right, so which would you recommend to master gas or hardwire first? Good question, John. Appreciate that. So If you can afford gas, I would always suggest gas first. For no other reason, you'll see as we start welding, there's a lot of when you weld the flux on the outside of it, right? It becomes a mess fast. And if you want to start welding sheet metal, I'm not going to say it's impossible to weld with Fluxcore. You're really going to have to be on your game to weld Fluxcore on sheet metal. But with gas, it's real easy because you can stitch it and then go back, clean it off. It doesn't require near the heat, and it's much easier. And you have to manage the gas, obviously, but I think that for a brand new welder, it definitely shortens up that learning curve. Now, if you've welded stick in the past, then I think for you that the Fluxcore MIG, you'll pick that up really quick. Good question. Thanks, John. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the movement. So standard Fluxcore, you're going to be in position vertically, and you're going to drop back about 20 degrees, 10 to 20, somewhere in there. You don't want to be straight vertical because you want to try to keep the welding wire on the leading edge of the pool. What you don't want to start doing is getting behind the slag. So as you're welding, you don't want to get your welding wire too far back up into the pool. Let me draw that a little larger, right? So as you're welding, you want to try to keep your welding wire out here on this outer edge. If you start getting back up into this area and letting it backfill around the wire, you're going to start getting inclusions from your flux core, from that flux getting behind it, right? So there's an old saying that with that when you weld with slag, which is what flux core is, you drag. So with slag, you drag. With gas, you push. So it's and you know you'll see. I hear old timers all the time say, "Well, you can push it all. You can push flux core. You can with experience, but as a general practice, I would never suggest it. So if it's got slag, you drag. So it's flux core, stick welding. Is that a always scenario? No, but I'll say for the general, especially when you're starting, you drag. But make sure you're staying out here on this leading edge. Now, as we weld, typically what I'll do is I'll make a bunch of little C's, right? And I'm just going from edge to edge, just filling everything in. And depending on how much you have to fill, it's up to you. Fitment is everything. If you've got to fill a big gap into something, you probably should look at the actual fitment of it altogether. Trying to see the questions here. And that's going to be true on really any kind of welding you have, right? So fitment is king. Think of it like this. If you're driving down a road with potholes, you'd rather drive down a road with no potholes or with potholes. You know, the potholes causes resistance and damage. It's the same thing. So a couple different ways we can weld, right? You can just weld stringers on a flat. You have lap joints, which is just basically two pieces overlapping. You're going to weld on this joint right here. And there's T-joints, which is typically going to be, you know, the bulk of your welds. Now you can butt weld. Now, if you butt weld, make sure that you bevel heavily. Otherwise, you're just relying on a little bit of penetration that you get, you know, in the butt itself. Let's see, John, would you push or pull rule apply when welding vertically or upside down? Vertically. So let's talk about vertical. So there's a couple scenarios there. It's called vertical up and even call it vertical down, right? It seems like that jumbo shrimp oxymoron, right? But when they say vertical, they're just describing a direction, and then whether you're going up or down. And on slag, on Fluxcore, you almost never weld vertical down because of the slag inclusions, right? So you almost always weld vertical up. And overhead, I'd have to think about that. I would think out of position overhead, you would still want to drag no matter what. And if you guys can hear me, or if I feel like I'm screaming into the mic, let me know. It's corded, so it's right here. I'm used to being loud, so let me know. So if I was Fluxcore welding, I would do vertical up. And that way I could always stay ahead of the slag versus having it roll down into overhead. Boy, you're still going to have to drag. I would do all you can not to have to weld overhead though, because that's a whole different skill level, if you will, because your settings all change. Your settings change on vertical and your settings change on overhead. And typically I'll turn it down 20 or 30% on wire feed, but flux is a little different. So you're going to have to experiment with that. And that's a great question, John. So thank you. So I would also suggest starting your welding Bible, if you will. As you go, you get to learn your settings of your machine and write those down. Because what's going to happen is you're going to weld something up, and you're going to start up, and you're going to think you remember the exact settings. Now, if you've not changed it, right, that's fine. But write your settings down. That way you know exactly, look, on this thickness material and under these conditions, was it humid? Was it not? All these things play into this. Keep your Bible and write your scenario down there so you can quickly dial feed and speed, and you can dial it right in. Right. And another thing we're not going to cover, maybe on another live, but we're not going to cover material prep. So, but I want to touch on that for just a split second here. So on your surface of your material, whether it's cold roll and it's like a pickling on it, or it's hot roll and you got this really thick scale. Now, if you're welding angle iron or something like that, you definitely will want to get that scale off of there. So let's see, John. Oh, okay, same question. All right, so make sure that you're removing the mill scale, whether you're using it with flap disc, grinding stone, or something, because especially on hot roll, that takes a lot of heat and power to burn through that. So you're going to lose a lot of penetration of your weld just getting through that mill scale and not actually getting good penetration in your welds. And if you got the system turned down and you don't realize it, when you're welding through that mill scale, you really will have no penetration. It's literally just sitting almost right on top of the mill scale. And if you're doing anything marginally structural, which we are not teaching here today, you could have some catastrophic damage. And maybe later another video we'll cover a little bit more than that. But a lot of this stuff is in videos on the channel as well, so you can always go back and see. And if I know most of you are, but if you're not subscribed to the channel, please do that. It helps the channel. And once you subscribe, you always have the option, if you want to become a channel member. We do try to put some longer form videos out there and everything for those people. So that's much appreciated. Okay. So let's talk about some settings here. And if there's things you guys want to see or questions, this is kind of a fluid, I'll say, lesson, if you will. So don't be afraid to put it up in chat if there's things you want to see. So I've made a little cover so that I can slide it over the camera. We're going to run a few beads here. So let's talk about settings. Two things. The older I get, the more I appreciate hair, the harder it is to grow. And we're not going to run a respirator on this. I find I mumble enough without it. All right, Dod Z, let's see. do a quick dance for us all. That's a paid subscription level, and so we'll see. So that's super chat type stuff there. All right, so let's see what we got. Thanks, Kevin. He said he's got $5 on it. All right, so what I want to cover real quick is what a good bead actually kind of sounds like. Because with this, it's really about the sound is going to be your first indicator of how things react. So I'm just going to lay a quick bead down here, and you'll hear as I'm welding, it's got a nice frying sound. And I'm just watching that weld pool. I'm trying to keep the stick out around a 1/2 inch and trying to maintain that. Right. That's right, John, fan only page. So you can see that, you know, with Fluxcore, it's a lot dirtier of a weld. Now, when this cools, you'll have to chisel that off and you'll have to brush that. And what I would suggest there is a wire wheel on an angle grinder. It's going to be your easiest. If you don't have that, chip and hammer and a wire brush. But once again, if you're going to do a lot of Fluxcore welding, wear a respirator. You'll appreciate that later when you're coughing all the garbage up. All right, so that's what I'll say it sounds like when it's right. Sorry for all the camera movement. The multicam studio is not here yet. Maybe we start dancing more for Kevin. We'll get the multi-cameras. So what does it sound like when you're trying to run too fast of a feed? And you'll hear this, it'll pop and it'll like pulse when I weld. You'll be able to hear this. Hear that pulsing noise? So that pulsing, that surging sound is the wire having to hit and then burn back. And then as it gets closer to ideal, you get that nice, as you get closer to ideal, you get that nice, it's always called bacon sizzling sound. And it definitely, it makes for a much better weld. And obviously, if it's pulsing, you're getting slag inclusion into the weld as well. Let's see. Josh B, yep, always sound like frying bacon. Exactly right. You'll get that nice sizzle as it's welding. So if you're getting that pulsing, or if you're in extreme cases where it hits and you'll see it burn back, right? Those are always too fast. You'll have to stick around at the very end for. Thanks for the $5, Kevin. You'll get a. We'll see. Well, you gotta love your Jeep buddies, right? Thank you. But the option for the super chats are there on in the chat room. It's not so become a dancing monkey, right? All right. So the big thing is your feed. You always want to make sure that the feed is right and not just pulsing. You don't want it to hit and then have to build up heat to burn off. And you're going to have to play with your settings. If you look at your settings for welding with hard wire, your feed is going to be a lot lower with flux than it will be with your feed with your flux is going to be a lot lower than with your hard wire, almost always. Now they have what's called a dual shield, which is it takes a flux core wire and introduces gas with that. That's not what we're doing here, right? So there's a couple things that I suggest that we do. I suggest a lot of people, everybody loves Harbor Freight, self included. Get you some scrap and run short stringers. Just draw you a couple lines on it and start out by just running the stringers. Don't try to run these 3 or 4 or 5 inch long stringers. Run a short stringer and then have multiple pieces so the heat doesn't build up. Because if the heat builds up, that's going to change your weld parameters and profile altogether. And just practice running the stringer, running the stringer. So a couple things you want to do when you're doing that. I can sit here and just stay on a torch all day, but you're not really going to be able to see much. I'll put that cover I've got over it here in a little bit. We'll run a couple. But when you first start, you're going to form a pool, right? So get the pool started. You want to try to get the pool. I'm gonna say around 3/16 to maybe a 1/4 inch in diameter, right? And those are very generic numbers depending on what you're trying to weld. Let's see. Short is good. Long means you have to move your hands. See, Home Depot had small chunks of, yes. So Josh is 100% right. You can go buy small pieces of steel at Lowe's, Home Depot, whatever is in your area, right? So sorry, I got to keep reading to be respectful and read everybody's comments. And Kevin, you're right. Short is better because you don't got to start traveling, moving your hands, right? And we'll talk about that for a second. But back to Josh's comment. So I buy all my stuff at a place called Metal Supermarkets because I can walk in and buy scrap. And a lot of these places, they'll allow you to pick through their scrap bins. But if you just need practice pieces, Josh is 100% right. Go up to your Lowe's or Home Depot. Just don't buy galvanized. And you'll know what galvanized looks like. Don't buy that because then you're burning off all that galvanized. And that definitely ain't going to do you any favors. Excuse me. And on that note, you go buy any other kind of scrap. Everybody likes to get scrap just to practice with because you need to burn a lot of wire. However much wire you plan on the job, buy one spool that's going to be nothing but practice wire. And then to Kevin's point, keep it short because once you get your pool formed, from there, you're going to slowly fill. Now, what you're looking at is this pool on the leading edge. This is where you're watching. Don't worry about, you should be able to see the bottom of this out of your peripheral. You're watching this pool as you form, right? And you're just trying to walk that molten pool down through your joint. If you get going too fast, this will be froze and you're just putting these, stringers down here. You have to walk that pool where you want it to go. And that really is true for just about any kind of welding. You're always trying to manage that pool. Yeah, just be metal yards are always the best, but the box store is more convenient for some. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a lot of times that you can go to some of the metal yards and they have scrap they're just trying to get rid of. Now, if it's a shop to where they're selling all fresh virgin stuff, you're gonna have to pay for it regardless. But it's nothing wrong with just finding a chunk of steel somewhere, clean it off, get all the rust and the goo off of it, and start running your stringers. But manage the pool as you drag it, right? Remember, slag you drag. But cleaning it is everything. Don't try to weld over all your rust and all that other stuff. And you get used to the more you weld. So after it cools, I mean, they're not pretty welds at all because I'm trying to talk and do everything else. But you can see I was playing with the settings here. All right. You'll never, at least in my experience, I've never been able to get the same looking welds with flux that I can with gas, right? Because you're trying to manage the flux and everything else. But when you're practicing, so you're going to find that Fluxcore, it makes a huge mess, right? I'm not welding on my table, just showing you, right? So draw yourself some very short lines. So that is just so that when you're holding your gun, prop yourself. Don't have your hand unsupported because you're going to be really shaky. Prop your hand, and that way you can just rock your hand back and forth. That's all you want to start with right here, right? As you get better, you'll actually glide your hand across whatever you're welding, which is going to be where you want your gloves, right? Because that's going to get hot. But start with just a very basic here to here. So your gun is not going to be vertical. It's going to be back about 20 degrees in line of whatever you're welding. And you're slowly working that pool. Now, when you start, just try to drag the pool. Don't try any motion. Later, you can try a small C to fill from joint to joint to joint. But it's very crucial to get this part first. Now, maybe once you get to be an old hand at this, which, I don't consider myself that, you're going to make some crappy welds. It's part of it. Just a lot of times when you think that you got it, the welding gods are going to kick you right where it hurts and remind you you're not there yet. And that's just part of it. You can never get enough practice at this. Right? It's not something you're going to just pick up a welding torch and start welding these Instagram style beads. It doesn't work like that. It is a game of practice. It's like many other things in life. It's all about seat time, and it's a learned muscle memory that if you stop doing it for a while, you gotta pick it right back up again. So you'll always have to keep practicing. There really is no way around it. Let's see here. God Z, Austin Community College showed me everything I was doing wrong for years. And I have welds I can trust now. Oh, 100%, right? So it's always good to have someone else looking over your shoulder as well, because when there's no one to tell us we're wrong, we're always 100% right. That's just the nature of that beast. And if there is a small community college or something like that, I know from talking to several gentlemen that live in Texas and have been in the military. I think you said that there was some programs where you could take community college through, I guess it's through your military service. And, you know, if something like that's available in your area, I would always advise to do it through night school as a hobby, right? Especially if they're offering you free training. So something else I would definitely suggest if you're welding Fluxcore, anti-spatter spray. So every day before I start, I spray my table down and wipe it off with this stuff, because just that little bit I welded here, it's already a huge mess. So if you've got a lot, and you can spray it right on your material. Now you can't soak it in it. Give it a light spray, and that allows, you know, these little BBs and stuff like that to pop off here real easy, right? Now, I'll be the first to say, are these Instagram welds? Oh, hell no, right? Let's see. Unlearning is bad, always harder than learning. Oh, absolutely right. So, you know, as a guy, I've always found, and I've done some instructing and other things in community college, that once you get past, and I throw myself in with this, once you get past the ego train, and then we start learning. I've always found that usually guys, we got to start with that, and then we work together. I've always found that women just accept it and just learn without the ego. But yeah, you're right. A lot of times it's harder to unlearn and relearn than anything else. All right, so let's try this, a simple lap joint, right? We're not going to weld the whole joint, but what we're going to do is I'm just going to set them together, and we're just going to weld from, you know, like a small C in that joint. Once again, these are unprepped. Always prep your material. Let's see. Right, and then yeah, so Dodgy says, 100% right, Josh. I found a piece of angle iron. It was 4 times more Home Depot than my local metal yard. Oh, absolutely. Right. But by the same token, if you're going to buy a refrigerator, if they had one at the metal yard, it'd be 4 times more. So, you know, every store's got its perk. And, you know, if you want to buy scrap metal, but in the pinch, when you're in that oh crap moment, it's a good place for it. If you guys are wondering, the table and the clamps and everything are on the YouTube channel. They're easy to build. You can buy the clamps for 20 or 30 bucks, or you can build them for a small fraction. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to come in here, and we're just going to, it's like a C, we're going to weave it just a little bit. So let's see how well this works. It tested well. So I'm just going to start the pool and then get moving. So I need to lower that setting, hear that pulsing sound. I need to get back to the good settings here. Quick wire. So now we're just going to start, get back in the pool. Now we're just trying to stay ahead of the pool. Keeping our distance. And you're just listening for that frying sound. Right. So it's definitely a lot messier, right? So a couple things as I'm weaving back and forth, when I get right here at the end, don't just stop. Walk the weld back just a little bit, like maybe a 1/4 inch. What you don't want to leave is this big fisheye here at the very end. So weld and then back up just a little bit before you stop welding, and that'll fill in this little inclusion that you're going to get from stopped welding. And you're right, Josh. I almost need a micro lens or a macro lens. Yeah, so I'm still trying to figure some of this out. So there's a couple other lenses I want to get for this. Now I love gas and I love TIG welding, and I'm learning the camera stuff slowly. So is this an Instagram weld? Absolutely not. You can see I was running too fast here. So as I'm coming through, I back up just a little bit to try to fill this void in a little bit more. But you're going to have to go through and play with your settings a little bit just to see what your system needs, because every one of them is going to be different. Yeah, and yeah, John, if information on that macro lens, I'd appreciate it, because like I said, I'm still trying to figure out how do I show this so that you can actually see it. And I know you probably couldn't see much in that. Yeah, that'd be much appreciated. I'm looking at a couple other auto shade lenses to try to do that. All right. So the big thing is just get some material and run your stringers. And remember, get your pool started, and then start walking it from there. Don't try all the manipulation at first. Just get you a good pool and slow down. And typically what I've seen, that however fast you think you're welding, almost by half. You see the mechanic how-tos are going to maybe important. Let's see. Oh, 100%. So what Dodge Z says, practice moving before you even start your welds, right? Oh, 100%. And you know, one of the other things I've seen people do is they'll actually tape a small marker onto the gun and just practice making those marks, right? So you would just take a small marker and tape it on, and you would hold it, and you would just practice making small lines. And that's 100% good, because that's typically how when I show someone how to TIG weld, that's 100% how I show them how to TIG weld, because you got to get used to where on a gun, you want to try to keep about a 1/2 inch stick out with Fluxcore. If you're off a little bit, it'll suck it up. With TIG welding, you got to be right on that point, right? So Dodge Z, that's an excellent point. Have you talked about gun angle in relation? Yes. So I have a little bit, but let's cover it again. So stick out with Fluxcore. Ideally, you want around a 1/2 inch stick out for the wire itself. Now I took the shield off. I keep my gas shield on because I don't want to cruddle over the rest of the nozzle, right? But if you have just the other style gun that's just got the shield over it, about a 1/2 inch stick out. Now what you want to do is, if your weld is vertical, come back 10 to 20 degrees and drag. That way you can stay on the right side of the pool. And if you're welding, if you're welding in a lap, you're going to be in the V and then back, right? So you kind of got like a little compound angle going on. And the same thing if you're welding in a T-joint, You know, you're 45 and then you're back 10 to 20 degrees as you weld as well. You can tack it and then start welding. So, yeah. Yeah, Josh, yeah, thanks for asking that. But the big thing is just start with your stringers. And, you know, Dad Z's point is 100% spot on. Maybe just tape your little marker and just hold and just practice marking the lines. Once you get to where you can draw a nice straight line with it, then you can start the manipulation back, forth. So what you could do there is get you a piece of metal eventually and just draw you two lines and maybe a 1/4 inch apart, and then you can practice the weave back and forth. And then you're looking for those white lines from the chalk. Now these wax pencils, you can get these at Harbor Freight as well. They'll either come round or flat, and a lot of times they come in a 2-pack. You got the rounds and the flats all in the same one. And yeah, so I'll cover that here in a second, Dod Z, about the let's see here, about spraying your gear down. Oh, absolutely. So practice running between the lines, and then eventually what you'll want to do is lay out the same thing for a T-joint. When you get to this point, you'll lay out the T-joint, and then you just practice in the T. So practice the movement first. And what you'll have to practice is the prop and the drag. Because typically what happens is as people start dragging, they'll not move their hand. They'll slowly start doing this, right? They'll slowly start bringing the gun back. And before you know it, instead of a nice glide across, it becomes this. And your gun angle changes drastically. So that's where having your other glove on and just practice the slide, if you will. Right? Not the electric slide. I haven't forgot about the $5, Kevin. So, but the Dod Z's point. So there's the splatter on the gun. So there's 2 ways you can cover that. Now they make this anti-spatter spray. You basically just dunk, right? So that's one option. I use it periodically, but not often. A lot of times, what I'll just use is the spray, and I'll spray this because I find that this works a lot better for me. If you end up using the shield, especially if you're running gas, run a small bead before you actually run the bead that you want, because you got to get all those inclusions out. And always clean your gun between runs, because as I sat this down, you know, that crud fell out. And you don't want that crud falling out in your weld. Right? So there's a couple things, just as suggestions. If you're running the shield, a pair of nozzle pliers, which is great because these ream the tips. You can take the tip off. If it's hot, they'll actually take tip off that way. And this is going to depend on which gun you have, right? But the pliers, you can ream the crud out of the very tip of it. The very end is for changing your contact point, your contact tip, which you definitely want to keep on Fluxcore. Keep an eye on this contact tip, right? These are all expendable items that you just change out. Always have extra, because as this starts getting burned up and the tip starts, if it starts clogging, and then you know, these pliers. Now I've found that a lot of times if you just hold it the pliers width away, it's almost a perfect perfect stick out. Let's see here. Let's see. Hands, arms. Yeah, so in the chat here, Dodsy, talk about having your arms and hands in the right position so that you can move. 100% right. You got to figure out what is the term in welding? Always be comfortable, right? You have to be in a good position so that you can move and you can. So even if, I'm going to move the camera here, right? So even if it's a small movement here, right? If I'm in a position to where, come up a little bit, to where I want to move a little bit, all of a sudden my arms are confined. Now my body's got to pick up the rest of this, and I got to start shifting my weight on my heels. Trying to be in a good spot to where when I'm rested, that I can run all the way across this easily. If I've got to start moving my hands, then my hips, then my legs, that weld's going to look like crap. Right? And obviously it's about how long of a weld you're running. So get in a good position so that you can just run. But it's really all about being comfortable. Josh, talk about when to change the tips out and why. All right, so the actual tips. So what you're going to find that as you weld, you're going to start burning these tips back, or they're going to start getting included, and you're either going to. Typically, what will happen is you'll start losing contact when you're welding. You'll see like the sputtering effect, right, where the tip is actually getting wore out and it's not making contact on the wire good. You'll want to change these tips out. Also, I've seen these start getting really full of garbage, or you've dropped it or something, but typically they're just wore out. They're not making good contact. If your contact tip is super loose on your wire, that's not good either, because it's not making a good electrical circuit, right? So if it's not making a good path for the power to flow through, remember, Fluxcore is electrode negative, so it goes negative to positive. If it can't flow easily through the gun, through the wire, and then into the workpiece, you're not going to get a good transfer of current. So if you're welding, and to Josh's point, if you're welding and you try and you're doing real good, all of a sudden it starts sputtering. Typically, it's a couple things. Contact points wore out. That's a quick and easy check, right? The other one is check the tension of your wire to make sure that I've had wire that wasn't spun on the spool right, and halfway down it starts not wanting to come off properly, and you just sit there and fight it, and it can cause you a lot of grief. So I hope that answers the question, Josh. Something else, did you change spools? I'm going to just use this one. So there's not much left, so I'm not going to feel that bad about this. Now, I know that this isn't Fluxcore wire, but when you're handling the spools, make sure you keep tension on the spool, because the minute you let go the spool and it does that, you got to pull don't try to rewind this thing. Right? So if you're changing from spool to spool to spool, if it bird nests like that, you pretty much got to strip all of this wire off of there and then start from that point, because if you start winding it and it gets on top of each other, it's a mess. You're going to fight. You're going to wish you just bought a new spool by the time you're all done. And then the other place you use Fluxcore. It's still going. If you're welding a lot outside, Fluxcore is your go-to. So especially if you're in a breezy area, Fluxcore is kind of like, I'll say, you're like stick welding from that point of view. You don't have to worry about the breeze blowing your cover shield away. And I've got a video on the channel where I actually show what happens if you get a breeze and you blow your cover shield off from gas. If you're welding outside, Fluxcore is definitely your route to go. It's going to be a mess. Right. So, Dodzy, if you touch the tip, it can be a mess. You're 100% right. Won't feed out, doesn't come up smooth, burns the hole on the tip. 100%. So what Dodzy is saying is, if when you're welding, if you're continually pushing and not keeping your distance, and you stick this in and it melts the tip, you're going to fuse right there, and it's going to cause you. Don't try to sand the tip. Just unscrew the tip, cut the wire, and just throw the tip away. It's going to be much easier. And these tips are relatively cheap, right? You can buy a 5 or 10 pack, for a few bucks. Eventually, what you'll want to do is you're going to start out your Harbor Freights and your Lowe's and all of those. What I would quickly find is your local welding supply, because you're going to see a huge decrease in, at least for me, a huge decrease in your consumables, your tips, your wires. If your machine will take a larger spool, I would get it. If you can run the larger spools, they're much cheaper than the smaller spools. And then everything like your cover lenses. Now you can see it's hard to see the haze, but you're going to go through these cover lenses like candy with Fluxcore. It's just part of it. All right, so as a recap here, when you're holding the gun on your workpiece and then back 10 to 20 degrees, and just practice running stringers. And then don't try your verticals or your overheads at first. Get these down first. Get a couple pieces so that the heat doesn't bother you, because as you weld, they start getting hot, your characteristics are going to change. Get you a couple scrap, and then draw your lines between. Practice the weave back and forth. And more importantly than anything, respirator. Because if you're welding a lot, I know some of you guys have projects we've messaged back and forth about, you can do a lot of welding and those fumes all come up. And I don't care what they say, the hood's made to try to divert some fumes. It diverts around it, but your lungs become the filter. So try to do something there. And for myself, I have to wear reading glasses. Otherwise, I really cannot see that puddle. And then lastly, depending on the helmet that you're using, right? Now, I use the auto darkener. I guess if you're hardcore and you've been doing it a while, you can use a fixed shade. That's not me. I run it around a shade 10. I wouldn't try running this much lower than that, because Fluxcore is a lot brighter. And if you get done welding and you get that someone through sand in your eyes feel, that's flash burn, right? You need to go you need to be a little darker than that. Keep some spare batteries around as well. But the biggest part about Fluxcore, a lot of your techniques are very similar to gas, except for, remember, if it's got slag, you drag, and that's drag to weld. It's always good to take a piece, section it, and see what your penetration looks like on the weld. That way you can figure out if you need to go hotter or not. Start with that breakdown on the machine itself. and it'll tell you exactly where to start from. Cheater lenses help a lot. Oh, absolutely. So they make a magnified lens. I've seen them go in the helmet. I've seen them go on the unit as well. I've actually thought about using both because as I get older, it would definitely help. And remember that if you're on a machine that can run gas and hardwire, remember gas is DC electropositive, meaning the heat's coming, the gun is a positive and the work is negative. If you're running Fluxcore, it's the opposite. It's DC in where the wire is negative and the work is positive. Think about which direction the water is flowing. So if you go to weld and you can weld either or, you get this weird sounding. It's almost like a very, very high pitched like hiss or sizzle. You're probably running reverse polarity. All right, so that's all my dancing. That's all you get. Sorry. Yeah, no, it's cheap, it's cheesy, but this ain't bait for dancing. So I'll leave a link for all this stuff in the descriptions, and I'll also leave a link in there for a Discord room that if you guys want to talk more about this, or you want to tell me how full of crap I am, or we want to discuss that, hey, I'm game for that as well. Right? I don't claim to be the expert. Remember, this is not code welding. This is not structural welding. This is the guy in the garage who wants to get started, and where you take it from there is entirely up to you. And I appreciate everybody who's joined. And if there's anything else you want to see, let me know. Remember, on the channel itself, there are other videos where I do some section cuts and show you how to check your penetration on the depth for the weld. And there's a lot of other fabrication stuff on there. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so. When you subscribe, there is a chance, there's an option to become a channel member. We always appreciate that. And everybody who joined, thanks for coming.